Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this installment of Museum Mixology with the Tallahassee Museum. My name is Lacey Ballinger. I'm the Director of Collections and Exhibits at the Tallahassee Museum. We offer this virtual series bi-monthly on Thursdays at 6 p.m. So check out our website on the events page and you can see our future ones listed. I've got the next 3 months planned out, but I don't have them all posted yet, but I will be getting to that. I'm really excited with the lineup for this spring. We've got so many great people that are wanting to work with us. So we have speakers ranging from archaeologists like tonight to Olympians. So this series is designed and dedicated to our adult audience, but we hope it is a fun and learning experience still about history, natural science, and wildlife with a little bit of true crime thrown in every once in a while. And if you're so inclined and would like to see us continue this series, there is a virtual tip jar set up. I've posted the link in the chat room, and we thank you for your generosity. Some weeks we will be discussing topics that are difficult or sensitive, and we may do topics that are relevant to current events. So we do encourage you to carefully read the descriptions and make sure that maybe your kids aren't around or you monitor the age group that you have watching. So as a museum, it's our duty to interpret and contextualize political, social, and cultural history, as well as advancements in science and technology. And through this virtual series, we strive to have an honest, open-minded learning experience where it is safe to express differing opinions. And we appreciate everyone not picking fights. So for tonight's topic, we are going to kick off Archaeology Month in Florida with Nicole Grinnan. She is with the Florida Public Archaeology Network. She works with FPAN, which is a program of the University of West Florida. She works as a research associate and public archaeologist in Florida's Northwest region. Her research interests include maritime archaeology and history, public interpretation of maritime culture, resources, and social history. Before joining FPAN as a public archaeologist in 2012, she worked as an outreach assistant with FPAN, an intern with Biscayne National Park as an assistant with NASA History Division. Nicole is a registered and professional archaeologist, a certified interpretive guide through the National Association for Interpretation, and a scuba instructor, which you may have noticed she spoke during our underwater archaeology talk a few months ago. She currently serves on the board of directors for the Society for Historical Archaeology and for the American Academy of Underwater Scientists. She graduated with a master's degree in historical archaeology from the University of West Florida in 2014 and received a bachelor's degree in anthropology and a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Central Florida in 2010. She's currently working on her doctorate in cultural heritage with the Iron Bridge International Institute for Cultural Heritage at the University of Birmingham in the UK, not Alabama. So we are going to turn it over to Nicole for her fascinating topic tonight about the myths and mysteries of Florida archaeology.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me this evening. It's great to speak with you all again. I'm excited to do it. I was asked to give probably one of the more exciting and fun talks that we've got. So I really look forward to talking about fantastic archaeology in Florida. So let me go ahead and wrangle my screens here and I will share my presentation with you all. All right, let's see. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, good. Thank you. Excellent. So if anyone has any questions during the presentation, feel free to go ahead and use the Q&A section in Zoom or the chat function in Zoom as well. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. If I don't see it while I'm giving the presentation, I'll be sure to get to questions once I'm done in the order that they're asked. But yes, please do feel free to ask questions about this topic. It's very interesting.
And I'll help monitor too, Nicole, in case somebody pops in.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. So this presentation is called Fantastic Archaeology, Florida Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries. And so what our goal is today is to talk about what archaeology is, and probably more importantly, what archaeology is not. So let's go ahead and get started. Oh, No, we need to go to the very beginning of this presentation. So many screens. Let's go to the beginning. Yes. Okay. Moving forward. Here we go. All right. I've got 3 screens going on here. Sometimes it's hard to keep all of them straight. So fantastic archaeology is not something new. It's really something that's been around for a very long time. And I think today, as archaeologists and as a scientist who does a lot of public speaking and presentations and outreach and education, I think there's a lot more discussion about real archaeology and what is not real archaeology. And I think this is an important discussion for many reasons. I think very relevant to a lot of other conversations that are going on today. And what I'd like to start with is this slide about things that you may have heard about in the past. And maybe you have, maybe you haven't. You probably heard of at least one of these. But each of these images really is meant to convey a fairly convincing evidence for each of these things. One being ancient astronauts, right, in the form of these kind of malformed skulls that we see. They look human, but they're very strange looking. Maybe they're not human. We see maps from the historical period and the early colonial period portraying the island of Atlantis. And that's a myth that's been perpetuated for many, many years. And then there's a myth of King Tut's curse as well, or the story of King Tut's curse, because the discoverer, or one of the rediscoverers rather, of the tomb died shortly after finding it. And so what happened there? Was King Tut's grave, his tomb, cursed? And so kind of think about where you are on the skepticism meter for these things. That's kind of one of the cool things about this presentation is it kind of asks you to be involved a little bit. What do you believe? Well, what do you not believe? So where are you on that skepticism meter? And so I'll just kind of throw out real quickly. This presentation does talk about things that may challenge beliefs you have. And the presentation is from the standpoint of science, because I was trained as a scientist. So, nothing I say here is meant to offend or to be intolerant of other people's ideas. This is my own perspective, and that's what I'm here to present from the perspective of an archaeologist. So just to put that out there ahead of time, if there's anything that is triggering or anything, obviously take everything I say with your own personal grain of salt, however you want to approach this presentation. But I just like to put that kind of in the forefront as we go forward. Really the key for my presentation here is to increase awareness about real archaeology that takes place and the really fantastic things that it tells us about the human story in the past, and also to increase skepticism about things you might hear on the news, online, on Facebook, wherever it might be. It's not meant to be intolerant or to be dismissive of other people's beliefs. So let's talk about the science of archaeology in general. Archaeology is indeed based on science. We often hear it called a social science, and that's because it is the study of people who tend to be very chaotic, and you can't pigeonhole people into a science often. But the definition of archaeology that we use is that it is a study of past people and culture based on the things that they've left behind. And the archaeo term for things that people have left behind is material culture. Archaeologists use the scientific method. We don't put a shovel in the ground without a research question, without a hypothesis that we can test. We then collect data, analyze that data, make our best interpretation of that data, and remain open to other interpretations based on additional data, right? That's kind of the classic definition of the scientific method. We also publish in peer-reviewed publications. We have our colleagues test what we've done. We curate the materials and the data that we collect. And then we work on retesting and refining our hypotheses over time. The archaeology of Florida as we knew it 100 years ago is very different from the archaeology of Florida as we know it today, because we've gotten more data over time and we have better tools to help us answer the questions that we've had. And one thing about archaeology as a scientific discipline is that it is very rigorous, right? In addition to following the scientific method and going through all of these other steps of the scientific method, we typically like to say that for every one day that archaeologists spend in the field, we take about 3 to 5 days back in the lab and back in our offices, looking at what we've collected, analyzing artifacts, looking at historical records, if we can use them, and then putting that story together. So archaeology is a very rigorous discipline, and it takes a lot of time, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it. So archaeology, like other branches of science, we're not alone in this, it often gets conflated or confused with pseudoscience. And so what we've got here is just an idea or kind of a notion of what archaeology is not, right? Archaeology is not generally about beliefs and religion, right? Those precepts or concepts are not generally testable. So it's not something we can really study with the scientific method. Archaeology is not treasure hunting, right? Treasure hunting is generally completely uncontrolled excavation, looking for very specific cultural material, treasure, right? Things that are of value. For archaeologists, that's not tenable, right? We don't do uncontrolled excavation because, we can't repeat our results essentially, right? Not following that scientific method. And for archaeologists, every piece of cultural material that we find is of value, not necessarily monetary value, but of value to learning more about the story of people in the past. So not treasure hunting. Archaeology is also not default reasoning, which generally is conclusions based on general rules, right? We need to have testable hypotheses. And archaeology is also not posited. We don't assume something as a fact without evidence of something. And so the images you see here are, and we're going to talk about all of these, images of, on the far left here, the Cardiff giant. In the middle, the Piltdown man's skull. You may have heard of some of these. And on the right, this one's a little closer to home. This is a pyramid marker in a cemetery in St. Augustine. And I will go through each of these during the presentation. Now, pseudoscience, which might be categorized under the things that archaeology is not. Pseudoscience is a field of study that claims to be scientific, but does not necessarily use the scientific method. So a little different than what we were just talking about, but not totally different. The difference is that they're not just beliefs. It's when these things pose as science that the trouble begins, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So there's a couple of examples on here of things that are pseudoscience, things that generally believed maybe to be real or to be scientific or scientifically explored, but there is no good scientific method backing those things up. And one of the things that people often ask me about, one of the images that you see here on the bottom left is the Shroud of Turin. This is a really interesting one because it absolutely has historical value as an artifact of the past. Scientists with the Shroud of Turin research project reached a conclusion in 1978 after looking at the shroud that it was indeed authentic. But many of those scientists had already made up their minds about this, and their findings were essentially reported as science, even though they didn't use rigorous scientific methods. But in 1982, additional studies were done and allowed on the shroud and showed that the blood that was on there was artist's red pigment called vermilion. And this was a paint that was used in Europe right around AD 800 rather. And so carbon dating done and allowed on the Shroud of Turin puts the cloth at an age of about AD 1325 or AD 1325. So is the Shroud of Turin what people have claimed it to be? Not necessarily, and probably not based on scientific research, but is it of incredible age and worthwhile to protect as a cultural artifact of the past? Yes, it is. And it represents a lot about the culture that produced it and that continues to value it, right? And then our center picture here is of crop circles, which are fun. And then the one on the far right is that of the Mars face, which really is just a crater mountain assembly on Mars that looks a lot like a face. So why do pseudoscience and things that are not archaeology keep getting perpetuated? Well, that's because people have motives, right? And I think the goal is with the scientific method that we eliminate those various motives. We essentially try to take ourselves out of the picture. But when you're talking about pseudoscience or things that aren't real archaeology, you can't, it's difficult to separate those motives when you dig in deep on some of these. And so a lot of these, this notion of what motives are for various frauds, myths, and hoaxes of the past come from a book from an author called Feder. And I have a link for him at the end if you're interested in learning more and reading his book, which is really interesting. But things that are motives include money. There's a big motivator right there. Fame, another big motivator. Nationalism, a romantic past with a capital R, right? Looking at things that not just because they were better in the past, because it represents really something important about a better past. It appeals to our romantic view. Mental instability in some cases. Revenge is another example. And then mistakes are just made sometimes too. People try to apply scientific methods. Maybe they don't have the proper training, or maybe they just do it poorly, right? Maybe they are trained properly, but it just hasn't been done rigorously. So all these kind of things tie into why various frauds, myths, and mysteries get perpetuated over time. And you've got a couple of pictures here. One is of an Egyptian tomb opening. This is not necessarily bad science per se, but this particular image is staged, right? It was staged for the media, essentially to generate speculation, to promote the work that these people are doing, and maybe to promote nationalism at a certain level in Egypt. But again, cool, not necessarily how things actually happened. And the second image on the right, this is a painting of the Piltdown Man discovery, essentially a commemoration of a hoax, which at the time was very serious, but now is fairly humorous. So what's the harm in pseudoscience, in these kind of speculative things that people put forward? Apart from, issues with personal motives for gaining fame or wealth or whatever their particular motive might be, it's that pseudo-archaeology and pseudoscience diverts attention from real discoveries and prevents the public from connecting with authentic archaeology, which as an archaeologist is something we absolutely want. We want communities to be involved in their local archaeology to help it give them a sense of identity. And one of in the past, one of the big main themes in pseudoscience and pseudoarchaeology has been racism and other prejudices. And one of the images I have on here, this is the Treblinka archaeology hoax, which was actually a documentary. This was a poster for that. It's, in this particular case, the racism and the prejudice here is deadly serious and dangerous. This particular documentary supports Holocaust deniers' claims that Treblinka was actually not a Nazi death camp, complete with interviews and the like. And so again, a kind of a very dangerous, culturally dangerous approach to pseudoscience and archaeology. So beware of these kinds of things, or put on your skepticism hat when you're looking at these kinds of things and you see them online. And then there's a funnier one here. This was, I think, an image that I found on Facebook. This is a pseudo-archaeology image of a human in a giant skull, which in this case is just funny. But there are ways that archaeology, legitimate archaeological study, science in general, our cultural norms, our cultural beliefs, our ability to be inclusive in our daily lives can be harmed by this kind of pseudoscience. And we have many documented cases of that in the past. So before we jump into Florida specifically, I thought it would be interesting to talk about some myths kind of at large around the world. Some of the more famous ones that you may have come across on TV or just reading at home online, because these things do come up over time. One of my favorite ones to talk about is the Cardiff Giant. And I think maybe a lot of people in the United States have heard about this one. A farmer named Stub Newell discovered a giant on his farm while digging for a well in 1869. The giant was intended to be petrified, or that's the look that they were going for, to kind of go along with the petrified trees that he had seen in California and Arizona, right? Giving it kind of a fossilized look. The giant itself was about 10 feet long and 3 feet across, so a giant by any good standard. And Newell put the giant on display for 50 cents per view on his farm. And in the first 3 weeks of having the Cardiff giant, as we call it, on view, he made $7,000, which in 1869 terms was quite a bit of money. And in the first 6 weeks, he made $12,000. P.T. Barnum actually offered Stubb $50,000 additional dollars to use the Cardiff giant for 3 months for his tour. Newell actually turned down Barnum, and what Barnum did was he made his own giant and a second replica of the giant that he could tour with his circus. All 3 of those are still on display today, which is really interesting. The original Cardiff giant is at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York. One of the Barnum replicas is at a mechanical museum, and the second replica is at Barnum's Museum in Baraboo, Wisconsin. Interestingly, Barnum's replica outdrew and outprofited the original Cardiff giant. So unfortunately, Stubb lost out on that one. Charles Hull admitted the fraud. Now, Hull was a distant relation to the farmer Stubb Newell, and in his confession, he's angry that the people would believe the Bible. I guess there was some passage he referred to that said that 10-foot giants walk the earth. And so he was essentially mocking religious beliefs, or Stubb was mocking religious beliefs in production of this giant in some way. The limestone to create the giant was mined in Iowa, was brought to artists in Chicago, and then sent by train to New York to be on Newell's farm. And so this distant relative, Charles Hull, was in on all of this from the beginning. So when he came out and admitted to it, he had a fairly believable argument. I guess we could call it a sculpture created by artists, was brought to Newell's farm. What he did was he put it in the ground for a year to make it look like it had been old and in the ground for a long time. And additionally, when Hull came out with his tell-all, additional witnesses did indeed say that they saw a large wagon bringing the giant in, and they overheard the farmer Stubb bragging. So it was debunked rather quickly, this one. And what's interesting, when Hull first examined the giant, so this was the distant relative, he thought that it looked too much like him. And so an artist, I guess, had put some facial hair on it, which maybe made it look like him more. Hull, I guess, was very angry initially, and he attacked the giant with some chisels and knitting needles to give it a more pocked and worn look and to take away its likeness of him. He then poured acid on it, and I guess after all that, he was very pleased that the patina looked like veins on this particular giant. So we even have some process admittance there too. Also interesting, the giant was naked, right? You find a giant in the ground, of course he's going to be naked, right? They don't have our cultural norms. But for female viewings of the giant, they would cover up the lower portion of the Cardiff giant, which is pretty interesting. So what were the motives for the Cardiff giant? If we go through some of the things that we talked about earlier, these ones are pretty easy. According to Hull, one of Newell's motivations was a mockery of religious belief. Apparently he wasn't a very religious man. But I think more than that, the motivation was fame and money, right? Making a little bit of money, bringing some attention to the family. Who wouldn't want to make, what was it, $7,000 and then $12,000? Quite a big chunk of change for the time period. So, who wouldn't do that, I guess, if you were bored and on your farm in New York in 1869. Another really interesting and relatively famous myth, hoax, mystery from the past is that of Piltdown Man. And so to kind of put this into context, by the early 1900s, Charles Darwin's theory that people and apes are descended from a common ancestor was generally accepted in scientific circles, we'll say that. And this was published in his 1859 Origin of Species publication. Many scientists were starting to look for the missing link, right? Where could we tie back that ancestry to see where apes and humans diverged? And English scientists had largely been left out of the human origins debate. Many people were looking in other parts of the world, and England really hadn't been a part of it until that point. What one of the things that they thought that they wanted to find was a fossil that was essentially the body of an ape with a human skull, believing that the human brain developed before the human body. And then we kind of see this discourse in publications at the time. So there was a gentleman named Dawson who found remains that fit this profile on his property. And he wrote to an individual at the British Museum, asking this individual to come to see the site where he found these remains in 1906. And the British Museum accepted by about 1909. And an article was published in the journal Nature. And the gentleman from the British Museum, his last name was Woodward, estimated the remains to be at about 500,000 years old, which at the time was thought to be when kind of that divergence happened, right? When we had that common ancestor. And so the nickname for this particular set of remains is called Piltdown Man or Piltdown remains. Even at the time, Piltdown had some skeptics, but it had a lot of supporters. It wasn't until the 1920s and additional discoveries then, and then the find of a British Neanderthal in 1935, that the pieces of Piltdown Man didn't quite fit together anymore, right? So science had kind of moved forward. Other legitimate remains had been found, and Piltdown Man, the way that the remains were kind of put together, didn't quite fit what other science was saying. And so in 1953, it was proven that the fossils actually belonged to two different creatures. And I'm fascinated that it took people that long to kind of verify that. But the skull was actually that of a modern human skull that was chemically stained to look old. And the jaw on that skull was that of an ape, and we think probably an orangutan. So again, he was trying to target that discourse of something that showed the larger brain of human ancestry, but maybe a more primitive or more ape-like jaw structure. The individuals who were involved in this, Dawson, the man who had found the remains, died in 1916. And then the individual from the British Museum who had verified the remains died in 1953, shortly after, or I think it might have been before it was kind of debunked. So what were the motives in the case of Piltdown Man, if we think about it? Wasn't necessarily, I don't think, money or wealth, right? There wasn't a lot of that here, but certainly there were other things. Dawson, the man who discovered this, he wanted to be part of the scientific community. We have historical records and letters that he wrote saying that he wanted to be included in scientific society in England. But I think more than that, the acceptance by the British Museum was really a way for England to assert its importance in the role of human history, right? So maybe nationalism coming into play a little bit here. Don't want to leave England out. They've been around for a long time. They're obviously, very smart and very advanced and all of this. And here's the evidence based on these remains. And we know, and people at the other time were starting to know too, that just wasn't the case. It wasn't fitting into the other science that was going on. So very interesting. The bad thing about this, and when we talk about what the harm of pseudoscience and pseudoarchaeology is, that the discovery of Piltdown Man caused a blind alley essentially for scientists for many, many years as they tried to fit these remains into the human evolutionary tree. And really, like we said, it wasn't until about 1953 that it was debunked. And one of the interesting things too was that we had some witnesses come out after several years and talk about, Piltdown Man and the remains and how they were discovered. And one individual said, and this is a quote from this person, that nothing was ever found at the site when Dawson was not there. He's the only known person directly associated with the supposed finds at the Piltdown site, the exact whereabouts of which he never revealed, and no further significant fossils, mammal or human, were discovered in the localities after his death in 1916. And so that kind of, for me, is the smoking gun, right? Things were only found when he was around, and nothing was found after he passed away. So there you have it. We're putting on our skepticism hat.
Nicole, I think you've got a question from Holly.
All right, let's see. In historical studies, the photo of the opening of the tomb would still be a primary source, right? Even if the motive is promotion of nationalism. This makes me rethink primary sources. That's a really good question. I think you're talking about the one where they're opening the Egyptian tomb that I showed earlier. I can go back. Yeah, I mean, I would call that a primary resource. You know, and it's hard these days because so many photographs are staged for the media. And we have some great examples of that locally, of people at life-saving stations out on Pensacola Beach, saving members of a shipwreck that happened offshore. And then there's this photo of these big like men putting this lifeboat in the water to go save people who were shipwrecked on a sandbar. But the reality was that photo was staged right after the shipwreck took place at night, right? So there was no media out there. And then the actual rescue was done by the lighthouse keeper or the life-saving station keeper and his teenage daughter, right? Not by these big burly men showing the boat going in the water. So yeah, I mean, I think anything in that sense, you kind of have to take with a grain of salt the way that things may be staged. But, in the sense that it was something that actually did happen, I would say, yeah, it's certainly a primary resource. In the case of the shipwreck photo, we see the actual shipwreck in the background and we see the life-saving station there as well. So yeah, I would say skepticism hat, right? Again, kind of think about photographs that you see, even, photographs on Facebook and such today. I think you could also argue, if we really want to get into it, we talk about Instagram and how people put photos of their life and everything seems so wonderful. But 9 times out of 10, those photos are staged, right? And you're only seeing very short snapshots of their life as it happens every day. And, whether that makes us jealous or, whatever, really, you may not have a reason to have those feelings. It's the way that things are fed to us in a way. So hopefully that's a good modern tie-in. But yeah, that's a great question. So let's go back. We're not quite done yet. It's gonna make me go back through. Sorry, guys. All right, ancient aliens. This is another one that I love to talk about because, yeah, we get questions like this a lot as public archaeologists. Belief in UFOs is common. And here in Pensacola, Florida, where I am, we have a Navy base nearby, and there's a lot of the towns around here have very high ratios of UFO sightings. And we get questions a lot about what's going on in the skies at night. Although I probably gave the answer away. We do have a Navy base. It's a naval aviation base nearby. So I think probably 9 times out of 10, that's what people are seeing. And, most people probably hope that there are other intelligent life forms out there in the universe. I know I certainly would be comforted by that. But the problem in pseudo-archaeology and pseudoscience is when human-made things and human efforts are attributed to aliens or ancient astronauts, as some people like to call them. The images here have all been cited as historical and archaeological evidence for alien visitors. The one on the very top here, this is a Mesopotamian cylinder seal with people in a spaceship. So there's, I guess this is the spaceship here, and these are the people in the spaceship. The center one here is the Palenque pilot. This one you see a lot. I've seen it a lot on History Channel shows about ancient aliens. This was from the tomb of Lord Pakal in Mexico that allegedly shows a person here at the center in the controls of a spaceship. And actually, probably what it's being represented here is the descent into the Maya underworld. And there's all kinds of reasons for thinking that based on our understanding of Maya symbology and Maya hieroglyphs. And down here is another one. This is more local here in the United States. This is a prehistoric petroglyph showing otherworldly beings. But there are other ways you can interpret this as well. And I'm sure archaeologists working in Utah probably do have very different ways of interpreting this, more as stylistic ways of conceiving of the human body. And, the person in the middle who maybe is the most otherworldly probably had some social significance in the community. So there are other ways to think about these things rather than going straight for the alien explanation. And one of the problems with ancient aliens is that I feel like as an archaeologist, it really discounts human ability and human achievement over time by saying that some of our most fantastic structures and monuments and buildings over time have been essentially put together or motivated by aliens. it's kind of disingenuous, right, to human achievement and to our ability to problem solve and to build and advance in great ways. One of the other interesting parts of the ancient aliens discussion is racism, actually. And there's a book written by a gentleman named Eric von Daniken. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with this if you're familiar with the ancient aliens thing. This particular book goes through various monuments and archaeological sites around the world and describes why, basically he's exploring why are they so similar? Why are pyramids shaped the way they are all around the world? Well, because it's the most logical geometric shape for a tall structure, right? But he believes that 96% of the world's people was essentially incapable of creating these amazing and very precise, in many cases, monuments. And there's a reason to think that this is a very racial argument because of the places specifically that he's kind of discounting, right? Places like Africa, Middle East, Central and South America, right? These aren't Western places that he's denying the ability. They're non-Western places generally, or non-Western cultures. So a lot of people say that the race issue is kind of exaggerated in von Daniken's work, and a lot of people have seen him speak personally. But I think, it's important to emphasize that racism is still racism, and it's damaging to real archaeology and to understanding the human story of the past. No matter how nice it might sound in the book and in the talks that he does, to say that humans aren't capable is an insult to human ability, right? To do amazing things. And then, of course, I have one more motivation on here. That's for attention. People, the argument that aliens do things is attention grabbing, right? So why wouldn't you make that argument? Makes for great TV shows on History Channel. So let's move a little bit closer to home and talk about pseudoscience and pseudoarchaeology in Florida. And so I just threw a couple of images up here. We're going to talk about all of these things. So I'm just going to go ahead and move on. One of the things that I like to talk about is the Florida skunk ape, because I lived in the Sarasota area of Florida for a while, and the Everglades aren't too far away. There's also a fairly large state park, Mayaca State Park. And actually, I think this top image on the left here comes from Mayaca State Park area. And so the skunk ape, if you're unfamiliar with the skunk ape, he is a large ape-like creature, maybe an offshoot of human evolutionary history, kind of akin to the Bigfoot or the Yeti, if you're familiar with those. He's called the skunk ape because he allegedly smells really bad, like a skunk. And who wouldn't, living in the swamps of Florida, right, with all that hair? The earliest publicized sighting of the skunk ape was by a pair of hunters who claimed that their camp was invaded by the creature in 1957. The term skunk ape seems to have been coined sometime in the 1960s, with dozens of sightings being reported since. And they kind of come and go with time. There were so many claims of the skunk ape at one point that a bill was actually introduced in Florida legislature that would have made it illegal to take, possess, harm, or molest anthropoid or humanoid animals. That bill did not pass. And so some of our other images here, there is on US 41, kind of going toward Big Cypress National Preserve, there's the official skunk ape headquarters in Ochope, Florida, which I highly recommend visiting. Because of the kitsch factor. It's worth going in and getting your koozie or your t-shirt from this place, and to look at some of the evidence, again, wearing your skepticism hat, but looking at some of the evidence that they've put together for the existence of the skunk ape. And the skunk ape research headquarters was actually founded by a man named Dave Shealy, who was one of the first to see the skunk ape in 1974. So all of that being said, there's no real evidence of skunk ape that's been collected scientifically. There are no bones, there's no habitat, there's no hair. Footage and photographs that exist aren't really clear, and it's not enough to kind of say yes or no. Now, I'll say, that being said, I had a great teacher in human origins class as an undergraduate at the University of Central Florida. And he would always say that if you are driving in Florida and you see the skunk ape, don't stop your car and turn around. You just press the gas and you hit that thing and you run it over, because if there's one, there's more, and we need real evidence for the skunk ape. So there you have that. I'll leave that with you. Here's another really interesting one from Florida, kind of in the, again, South Florida area. This one is of Gasparilla the pirate. And this is kind of a classic pirate adventure story based right here in Florida. Gasparilla the pirate is based on the legend of Jose Gaspar, who was an exiled Spanish nobleman turned to piracy because of conflicts at home and with the government. He had a secret base in the Charlotte Harbor area of Florida. And when being pursued by the US Navy, he threw himself off of his flagship to avoid capture, was not seen again. But as the story goes, there's a lot of treasure buried somewhere, the usual thing. Now, there's no documentation at all in historical records of Jose Gaspar or Gasparilla the pirate. The first mention that we see in records is in a 1900 advertising brochure for Charlotte Harbor and Henry Plant's railroad to the Boca Grande Hotel, which is on Gasparilla Island, where the treasure is supposedly or would supposedly be found. So if it sounds like there might be a motive there, take it for what you will. And it's interesting, as an archaeologist and knowing archaeologists that work for the state of Florida, people still try to get permits from the state to look for this treasure, this probably non-existent treasure. And this causes a lot of additional work for archaeologists and staff at the Florida Division of Historical Resources who must deny those permits on the grounds that no real research question actually exists, right? I want to find treasure is not a scientific research question. And so if you are in the panhandle of Florida, you might be familiar with the local legend of the pirate Billy Bowlegs. He's in the Fort Walton Beach area, same kind of thing. His story of Billy Bowlegs, the pirate, has equally dubious beginnings as a tourist draw, and claims that treasure still exists somewhere, but it has not yet been found. And so, unfortunately, in that particular case, it's been very damaging, because some people believe that Billy Bowlegs' treasure is actually in a historic cemetery in Mary Esther, and people will go digging in the cemetery, which is problematic on a variety of levels and also highly illegal. So again, many motives here for the perpetuation of this story, but also very real implications for archaeology and historical resources, both for Gasparilla the pirate and for the Billy Bowlegs story. If nothing else, Gasparilla the pirate makes for a great party in the Tampa Bay area. So if you have the ability to participate in that, it's quite a bit of fun, a little bit like Mardi Gras in our Pensacola area here. Here's another really cool one, the Fountain of Youth. And if you've traveled to St. Augustine, Florida, and done the tourist thing in the St. Augustine area, you're probably familiar with this one. And the Fountain of Youth definitely suffers from the capital R of romantic notions in Florida. The Fountain of Youth is actually a very significant archaeological site, but it suffers from inauthentic presentation of what it actually has to offer, privately run. The Fountain of Youth property was bought in 1900 by Dr. Luella Day McConnell, who had made her money in the Yukon goldfields. So a very, strong and gritty woman. She apparently acquired the nickname Diamond Lil while working in Alaska and began to market her new property in St. Augustine. In 1909, one of McConnell's employees supposedly discovered a coquina cross and a silver cask with inked parchment from Ponce de Leon's expedition. And so for those of you who don't know, the Ponce de Leon was one of the first Spaniards to arrive here in Florida in 1513. So the legend of Ponce de Leon landing in 1513 at that very site, and the statue attributed to him, the Coquina Cross, it's a complete fabrication. We know this based on historical records. And based on subsequent archaeology. Ponce de Leon did land somewhere in Northeast Florida, according to records, but there is no evidence and no documentation to prove where his actual landing site was. But we know that those particular artifacts are not of that period. Now, what is the value of the Fountain of Youth State Park when we talk about real archaeology? The authentic archaeology of the site is that it was the landing place in 1565 of Pedro Menendez, and it's where he set up a temporary settlement for 9 months before moving east to Anastasia Island, which was the kind of the second settlement of St. Augustine. And as many of you probably know, St. Augustine is the site of the longest continually settled, lived in place in Florida and in the continental United States. So it's one of the oldest cities in Florida is what I'm trying to say. Sorry, it's been a long day. Dr. Kathy Deegan of the University of Florida, excavated the site for about 30 years to record the contact between the prehistoric villagers of Saloy and the colonizing Spaniards. There were artifacts recovered from the Fountain of Youth Park, and there's just a couple of images that I've put up here from their excavation. These trade beads and metal goods are personal objects that have become kind of symbolic of contact period sites in Florida. These are the beads, and then we here have a brass bell. Historical documents, structural features, and artifacts all reinforce the hypothesis that this was indeed Menendez's settlement site and an extraordinarily significant place. And I'll just kind of repeat for emphasis that it took Dr. Deegan 30 years to study the 9 months that Menendez settled and interacted with this place, right? So again, kind of just trying to drive home all the work that goes into real archaeology, but the many amazing things that can come out of it. Now, if you joined me for my underwater archaeology talk in, I guess it was mid to late 2020, you might be familiar with this. I'll never pass up a chance to talk about underwater archaeology in Florida. But another thing that Florida suffers from with a case of capital R in the Romantic past is in our shipwrecks and in our underwater cultural heritage. And we love good stories, and we love what sounds better, and we love what makes events more exciting, right? And there's a reason for that, especially with modern media and tourism draw to Florida. But this motive for pseudo-archaeology in this case can be, it's best seen in this love affair with shipwrecks. People think that historic ships are just sitting on the ocean floor with their masts standing, sails billowing in the current, with skeletons lashed to the wheel, kind of like you see in this image here. But that's not what shipwrecks actually look like. Shipwrecks actually look like these sites, right? And so this is a site in the Florida Keys. You can see the ballast stones from this particular shipwreck have become an excellent place for these soft corals to grow, and they've become a home for marine species in this area. Here is another shipwreck site. This one's in a freshwater spring in Florida. Again, that's what a shipwreck really looks like, not like this so much. And then this particular image, this is also a drawing, but of the ship overlaid, but the archaeological site what it looked like is what's underneath here. So we see a ballast pile. And then as archaeologists excavated, you start to see some of those timbers exposed. So if you travel to the Great Lakes or someplace with very cold water, you might see shipwrecks that look like they're intact like this. Probably not like that, that particular shipwreck. But if you go to the Great Lakes, you see many schooners and other vessels from the turn of the century period, maybe a little earlier, a little later, and they essentially look like the day that they sank, right? They're almost intact, and it's really incredible. Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary has a great website with lots of information about their shipwrecks. But that's just not what Florida archaeology is, and Florida underwater archaeology in particular. Treasure hunting is really an odd problem in Florida. The presence of Spanish ships and actual pirates in Florida's past contributes to it, as does the commercial salvage of some of Florida's historic shipwrecks, which is still allowed under Florida law. But the idea of treasure hunting in the minds of many people, which is perpetrated by the media and treasure hunter propaganda, is essentially fallacious and imaginative. Beachgoers, metal detectorists will never stumble across intact chests of gold and jewels on the beach, right? That just does not happen. And the map, like you see on the far left here, is a placemat from a fish restaurant in Fort Pierce. It's a little text heavy, but every single word on it is completely untrue, right? Not one correct fact on that entire placemat. And yet that's the information that people are getting when they come to Florida. When they go to the restaurant and they sit down and they're like, wow, look at all of this treasure in the state of Florida. And this contributes essentially to a cottage industry where investors, visitors, residents of Florida, whoever it might be, are fed a line of crap, essentially, about finding lost gold that enables modern commercial salvors to destroy shipwrecks in pursuit of personal gain. And it's an industry that's largely based on greed and finding people who will believe them. Now, the reality is that while several Spanish fleets did sink near the coast of Florida, all due to hurricanes, and I've outlined some of them there for you. 1622 down by Key West in the Florida Keys, 1733 along the northern Keys, and 1715 along the area that's aptly named the Treasure Coast. And then in Pensacola, our own shipwrecks from 1559, although those were exploratory and settlement shipwrecks, not treasure fleet wrecks. But most of these shipwrecks were heavily salvaged at the time by the Spanish, who used native divers and fairly advanced recovery techniques at the time. The majority of the lost goods, precious metals, as well as other New World products like chocolate, sassafras, dye, hides, all kinds of things that were worth a lot of money, those things were generally recovered. Modern treasure hunters have found some amazing things that were missed. And the Atocha, if you're familiar with Mel Fisher and the Atocha, that's a good example. But the return on investment is poor. And the cost of research and recovery compared to the scant findings generally outweigh the profit. The treasure for treasure hunters is in the pocket of investors, not on the seafloor. And so for the lure of get-rich-quick schemes on gullible people directly contributes to vandalism of shipwrecks, which is what you see in these two center images, someone who's stolen a porthole from a shipwreck. And then, And then this individual who's actually recording a shipwreck, this is an archaeology student here at UWF, when there was a press release about the discovery of a shipwreck on an island nearby called Dead Man's Island, people went out there looking for treasure and they tore the shipwreck apart. And so what she's doing is trying to record timbers that were left in the shallow waters. The looting of artifacts, the vandalism of shipwrecks, and the looting of artifacts, these things are all protected by state and federal law in Florida. But there's such a misconception about shipwrecks and underwater archaeology and what it actually is in the state. So that's why I included under one of our Florida frauds, myths, and mysteries. And apart from the loss of archaeological data, many of these sites are homes to marine ecosystems. And the loss of those sites is the loss of ecosystems and potentially as profitable dive sites for local dive shops. So there's my spiel on shipwrecks. Another really interesting kind of pseudo-archaeology in Florida are sugar mills as Spanish missions. And this is kind of in the peninsular part of Florida. Books published in the 1920s and 1930s erroneously contributed to the false idea that some of the coquina and tabby structures in Florida are evidence of Franciscan missions, kind of the East Coast equivalent of California missions. One really good example is in New Smyrna Beach. There's a plaque on this particular coquina tabby structure that commemorates the sugar mill ruins as a Franciscan mission that was built around the year 1696. There was a captain, a gentleman named Charles Coe, who actually published a pamphlet as far back as 1941, who immediately dismissed these claims. And this pamphlet was called Debunking the So-Called Spanish Mission near New Smyrna Beach in Volusia County, Florida. And the information on the plaque that was in place then, he said, was too preposterous for serious consideration of intelligent men, because it just doesn't line up with historical records and what we know about Spanish settlement in Florida. So if you see these things in your wanderings, again, putting on our skepticism cap, most likely they were sugar mills, which again are really cool in their own right. And there's another really interesting site in Central Florida. Central Florida seems to be the home to a lot of these myths. This is a site that's located on private property that's claimed to be associated with the Soto expedition and a later Spanish mission. And Soto actually only spent one night in the area, and there was a ton of stuff that was brought up as evidence for his stay there. But looking at it compared with other archaeological sites, it's just too much stuff for one night of stay. There was a coin, which I have in the image here. It's extremely well preserved to have been in acidic Florida soil for 500 years. And coins are also rarely found on Spanish colonial sites, whether they're sites, mission sites or exploration sites. Archaeologists have not been able to inspect the site or not allowed to inspect the site, and no outside review or corroboration of findings has happened here as well. The mission, if it was a mission site, it would have many burials. There's no indication of any burials here. Some of the beads that you see in this image here were inspected by the Smithsonian, who said that they were not beads found that would be associated with the period of the Soto mission, but that they were rather made in India in the 1850s. And that those particular images probably show the same bead taken at different angles. Now, if there was a mission site here or that, the claim that was there a little bit later than Soto, missions generally had large multi-component Native American villages, but there's no evidence of that. And the artifacts that are claimed to be part of the Soto expedition look nothing like the Soto encampment site in Tallahassee, which is at the Martin House, which is currently occupied by the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research. And that's a very well documented archaeological site. And so, Soto spent an entire winter in that Tallahassee site, and there were very few artifacts found at that site, which you would think would be very odd in compared with the relatively large amount of artifacts that were claimed to have come from the site in Central Florida. So another interesting one for our Florida myths and mysteries and frauds. And I think this might be my last one here as far as Florida hoaxes go. This is the Vero Beach bone, and this one continues to be in the news every once in a while. These were the Vero Beach bone, the Vero Beach site in general was discovered in 1915, and there were bones discovered there, and these bones were called the Vero Man, and based on geology, they were argued to be about 14,000 years old. The original fossils were lost in transit to the Smithsonian, so there's no real good chain of custody for those things, and we have no way to test them again today. New excavations have continued to investigate the site. There is a bone that was discovered at this time, a little bit later, more modern rather. And this was claimed to be authentic based on dating, but there's no hard evidence of where it came from, only the finder statements in the Vero area. There is a second bone that was discovered later on, I think also by a local fossil hunter, that had etchings in it, just like the first one. Sorry, I didn't mention that before. But it has not been examined by scientists. And so there's no way to really verify whether or not it is of the age that it's claimed to be. And there's Dr. Andy Hemmings, who's with the Florida Atlantic University, has been investigating the site. And he has a really good quote that I think kind of puts it succinctly. There are far too many unanswered questions about the bone, the one with the etchings in it and the later one. And it's not available for scientific studies. So as far as he's concerned, it may as well not exist. And that's why we record everything in place as archaeologists. We document it, we photograph it. Nobody has to take my word for anything. So very good quote from Dr. Hemmings down at FAU. And finally, we'll think about Florida inauthentic archaeology as we wrap up here. On the left is a picture of a replica wooden owl totem recovered from a wet site on Hontoon Island, but it's displayed in another location and without any context. The original is on display at the Fort Caroline Park in Jacksonville. And so, does this represent the site where it was found out of context? Not really. And does it represent that culture well? Not really. Is it an interesting artifact? Yes. But does it belong in this particular place? No, I would say no. And there's another really good example here, the Dade Battle Monument, which the Dade Battle was a part of the Second Seminole War, or just the Seminole War in general, in 1835. And this is a monument at the National Cemetery in St. Augustine. The pyramids are not necessarily a mystery, but the exact number of people buried beneath is. The plaque in front of the monument, or the pyramid, states that 1,406 individuals are buried beneath it. There's actually 3 pyramids, but historic records don't corroborate that at all. One source states that, there were 2 initial wagon loads brought into the cemetery a few weeks after the battle, and then 5 more wagon loads brought in later. So there's a conflicting account that has 7 wagon loads and an additional 2 more. In any case, the lesson here is to be skeptical even of signage in a national cemetery. Just because it's written in stone or bronze, as we see in our sugar mill, does not necessarily make it fact. So apart from acting as a conduit for a variety of motives, including very dangerous ones like racism and prejudice, pseudoarchaeology absolutely does divert attention from real discoveries and the incredible work and dedication that goes into thorough, peer-reviewed scientific research. And so, as I said before, pseudoscience and pseudoarchaeology, more focused, also prevents individuals from the public from connecting with authentic archaeology, instead creating false conceptions of a history that really in turn perpetuates prejudice, injustice, and just false knowledge in general. And so here's a good image here of 7 ways to identify pseudoscience. And so one of the I think biggest perpetrators of this is the History Channel and a lot of their programming. The popularity of pseudoscientific ideas, it's evident in these TV shows. And I think really the worst part is that they're supposed to be on what are reliable sources, right? The History Channel and History 2 would lead you to believe that these are indeed real history. And I think Oak Island is probably one that a lot of people are familiar with. It's a good example of what happens with wild speculation and uncontrolled digging. Something probably is going on at that site, but the area is so disturbed from hundreds of years of people out there digging around, from disturbing the area, that we'll likely never know what actually is going there archaeologically. If you want to see kind of earnest, well-intentioned people beguiled by unsubstantiated claims, poorly identified artifacts, and outrageous ideas based on little or no evidence, then absolutely watch that show. It has all of the best pseudoscientists. And so kind of circling back, as we like to do, what are your thoughts on these things now? Really, they all have logical explanations, right? Lord Carnarvon, we'll start with the King Tut's curse, did indeed die after participating in the opening of King Tut's tomb, but he died from natural causes. It was an infected bug bite. Dozens of people were involved in that particular project. Statistically, some of those people would die early, but the average age of death for that group of workers working on that site was 73 years, right? So is there a curse? Probably not. Do people die early from unfortunate reasons? Absolutely. Atlantis, in our center image here, it's shown on a variety of historic maps, but so are sea monsters, right? If you're familiar with historic maps, they're very beautiful pieces of art, but maps of that age are notoriously unreliable. Just ask Columbus, right? And then if we're talking about our ancient astronauts here on the far left, these were actually skulls excavated in Mesoamerica. And they're actually evidence of artificial cranial deformation, also called head flattening. And so essentially what you would do, it's carried out on infants, is you would take 2 pieces of wood to the head and you would kind of bind it. And over time, that head would grow and the organ encased within would kind of grow up instead of our normal cranial head shape. It's seen as early as the 9th millennium in Iraq, BC. And it still occurs in a few places today, like Vanuatu. So I always like to advocate for the application of Occam's razor, right? The simplest explanation is often the best. And if you apply it in daily life, it will help you navigate through what the kinds of pseudo-archaeology that you might be exposed to, or just life in general, to help you determine which things are frauds, which things are hoaxes, and which things are simply inauthentic archaeology, or whatever it is, being presented to you. And Carl Sagan, he wrote a really great book about this called The Demon Haunted World. I highly recommend anything Carl Sagan does. But in that book, he provides a baloney detection kit to help lifelong learners hone their skepticism skills. And I highly recommend checking that out. And so if you're interested in some of the publications I kind of mentioned peripherally during the presentation, or if you just want to explore the issue a little bit more, here's some of the sources we use. Ken Feder, that's one of the ones I mentioned early on in the presentation, deals specifically with archaeology, so very interesting. Carl Sagan, Stephen Williams, lots of good things to read here if you're interested. And I'm happy to send that along afterward if anybody wants it. And so that is it for my presentation. Thank you for bearing with me. I think we're maybe right at the 1 hour mark here, so that's good.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me.
Oh, we already got some questions coming in. Great.
Let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen here.
Yeah, Tracy says great information, very interesting. She'll never watch the History Channel the same way again. I was thinking exact same thing as I watch Oak Island every week.
And I hate to do that because I know people watch that show. It's just, and it makes for great television. It really does. But
it does. Okay. Dina says Dina Davis would love to have a copy of your book list.
Maybe if I can either send it to you if you would like, and you could send it out, or I will put my email in the chat box. If someone wants to contact me directly, they are welcome to that as well.
Okay, that's perfect. Or if you don't get her email, you could always email me and I can share it later.
Great. Yeah, that works.
Nancy, thank you for this wonderful presentation, full of great information, captivating, held our attention, and encouraged us to think more critically. Hunting Hitler. Jessica wants to know about hunting Hitler.
Okay, so that's a really interesting one. And I actually do have several colleagues who worked on that show. So there is a lot of legitimate archaeology and research happening on that Hunting Hitler show. What I will say is that the way the narrative is often presented on TV shows really dramatizes how things are found and recovered. So kind of like that picture we saw of the Egyptian tomb being open, what you're seeing is not necessarily how it actually unfolded. It's kind of traveling back and in some cases putting the pieces back together to make for really compelling television. So the science there is not bad necessarily in some aspects. But, again, you have to watch it with a critical eye and know that, there wasn't a documentary filmmaker the entire time that they were doing this research. It's usually, years of research that's kind of ended up into this fantastic thing. And now we have to go and make a TV show about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good question though. Very good question.
Kelly says, fabulous, so interesting, and History Channel.
I watched it religiously as a kid, and these days, I used to love documentaries on History Channel.
Well, they make my life a whole lot harder with everybody finding things and calling me and wanting me to identify what they found in their garage or attic or yard sale they bought. Yeah, History Channel's ruined it for me. Holly says she loves the pirate stuff because the whole buried treasure idea comes from fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And Dina, many thanks, is very enjoyable. And let's see. Holly teaches middle school language arts, which means that she supports social studies teacher on History Day. She's really made me rethink about primary resources and what would you say to a middle school student about primary sources and how to judge them?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question and goes into like digging deep into my historiography classes from grad school. Primary resources, we typically define those as resources that are of the time period, right? Or they were written or produced in that time period where something happened. And I think anyone who's familiar with history is kind of familiar with the phrase that history is written by the victors. Mm-hmm. I think it's just being able to understand biases, right, in written documents and in paintings in some cases, any kind of historical record, understanding the biases that might exist and looking at the primary sources with an understanding that there might be bias there, right? So I'm trying to come up with a good example off the top of my head. But, things like journals. So this is one of the reasons that archaeologists, they like to kind of hold archaeology up above history. But as archaeologists, we're covering the remains of things that people are doing on a day-to-day basis, which is not necessarily what people say that they are doing, right? We often say we're doing a lot of things like, yes, I worked 8 hours from home today. I sat in front of my computer for 8 hours, but did I actually do that? I'm not saying me personally, although maybe, but you could probably find evidence around my house that maybe I was doing other things like folded laundry or, whatever the case is. But, And archaeology too, one of the things I quite like about archaeology is that, you know, we find the remains from all people that were around. So history often is biased by the fact that a lot of people writing it or doing it were male or well educated. They typically weren't children or women or underrepresented or you know, enslaved peoples. So that's the interesting thing about archaeology too, is it helps supplement our historical records and helps provide an interesting contrast. So I guess in this particular case of middle school curriculum, and I'm going to be biased in saying this, but it might be interesting to bring in archaeological evidence as a form of source when talking about history, whether you're talking about you know, the American Revolution or more locally the Seminole Wars, considering those. So I hope that answers the question. It's just recognizing your biases and integrating that into your work a little bit. And that might be kind of deep for a middle schooler, but I think most kids have a capacity for understanding that, and we don't often give them enough credit.
But she did say most of her students do end up going to nationals, so that's very exciting.
So smart. Yeah, they're motivated kids.
They're motivated and
yeah,
willing to learn. We had a question about the recording. We are recording this. We will be posting it to our YouTube channel, Museums. I think it's under Tally Muse. If you have to search for it when you get to YouTube, or you can just search for Museum Mixology and it should come right up. Or maybe just Mixology. You might get a lot of drinks, but but it is under Museum Mixology as well. And I will have it posted probably within an hour of when we get done. So.
Awesome. And if anyone wants to have a conversation about anything or just wants to ask a question, I did put my email address in the chat box. Do always feel free to reach out. I'm happy to chat about anything, archaeology or Florida frauds, myths, and mysteries.
So your PhD is in marine. No, it's in historical, right?
Yeah.
Cultural history.
It's in cultural heritage, which is kind of an offshoot. Mostly it's looking at the interactions of communities with underwater archaeology and underwater heritage here in the state of Florida, which is really where I'm interested in archaeology. But yeah, kind of looking more at the interaction between archaeology and our communities. That's kind of what I'm interested in. Yeah.
Okay, that's why I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Underwater was your background or your main interest. So, okay.
Yeah. Esoteric terms to unpack all the time.
All right. Do we have any more questions out there?
Well, thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, we love having you. Are you kidding? Yeah, anytime. And we will be having our next lecture for Museum Mixology on March 25th at 6 p.m. Eastern. And the topic is becoming a champion, or how you become a champion. The speaker is a dear friend and longtime associate. He's a coach and he's coach for track and cross country at Ohio State, as well as a two-time Olympian. He's a medalist from the, oh, thank you, Glenn. Great presentation. So he is a medalist as well, Olympic medalist, and he will be talking about how you become a champion and the mindset behind that. It is on our website and the events page, so check that out to register. There's also a link there for our YouTube page, and you can check out all of our previous lectures. So we hope to see you then.
Awesome. Sounds interesting.
All right. Thank you so much, Nicole, and we'll see you hopefully sometime.
Absolutely. Yeah, just send me an email. I'm happy to do these talks.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.
Have a good night, everybody, and be safe.